part of my analysis of InFamous 2 and InFamous Festival of Blood. In the first one I've explored the move control scheme.
Save our city! Kill Marais! Save our city! Kill Marais!
Functional differences and advantages of the move interface.
Save our city! Kill Marais!
Bottom line was basically that having the risk dealing with camera control and so the thumb free to operate the face buttons results in a better usability of Cole's powers and abilities. But that really doesn't say much about the effort the developers actually put into the move implementation. Naturally benefits from the very same advantages, albeit to a less significant degree due to the less significant reliance on face buttons compared to InFamous. This analysis will therefore discuss the real star of the move implementation Sucker Punch came up with, which is not the control scheme nor the pointer behavior, but rather the camera control system. When it comes to pointer-based shooters, the trickiest part is not so much coming up with a smooth and responsive on-screen cursor, but rather engineering a camera control system that doesn't make you feel drunk. Striking the right balance between camera responsiveness and stability is not a simple feat, especially in games asking for frequent and fast camera evolutions along every axis. Well, Sucker Punch achieved just that in one of the most difficult contexts you can think of, that of InFamous 2 indeed, with its heavy emphasis on acrobatics and vertical gameplay.
I love that part.
So let's see how they did it.
Unlike other move-compatible shooters out there, InFamous 2 is surprisingly limited in terms of tweaking options. In SOCOM 4, for example, you get to adjust tons of parameters such as camera speed, pointer sensitivity or various dead zone sizes. In InFamous 2 instead, once you get past the usual calibration process, you are basically done. This is not a bad thing though, for the imposed parameters in terms of dead zone size and cursor sensitivity are pretty much optimal. The only adjustments you can make refer to the so-called camera settings, which you can set to beginner, standard or expert. In order to understand what these options actually do, I have conducted a few experiments and I've come to the conclusion that they simply affect camera speed, albeit to unproportional degrees. As you can see from the following comparisons, while the change in speed is pretty noticeable between beginner and standard, it is not as much noticeable between standard and expert, which is why a few people have been wondering if the expert option does anything at all. The simple answer is that it does something, but very subtly so. Using the rotating minimap as a reference point, I've measured and compared the time it takes for the camera to complete a full 360 degrees turn under different settings. It turns out that a full spin at beginner top speed is about twice as slow as a full spin at both standard and expert. The same applies to slower turns, meaning the gap in camera speed across the three settings is the same whatever the distance of the cursor from the center of the screen. As you can better understand here, while the standard camera speed is almost twice as fast as the beginner one, the difference between standard and expert is much less significant. The same applies to the aim camera as well. Notice how in every circumstance we get a difference of about 1.8 between beginner and standard compared to less than 1.2 between standard and expert. While minimal though, the extra speed provided by the expert camera setting does benefit camera control in terms of tightness, so my suggestion would be to go for it if you are okay with the standard speed and simply want to tighten things up a little bit. As you can tell from the following footage, expert camera control is pretty smooth and responsive, which coupled with the benefits over the DualShock 3 alternative discussed in the previous part of this analysis, easily makes of InFamous 2 the best example of a third-person camera implementation to date in a move-compatible game. There is more to it of course, but that's for further into this video analysis. For now, it's worth noting how circle strafing benefits from the expert camera setting, as it allows to keep the target pretty close to the center of the screen. Notice how the small dead zone, coupled with the fastest camera turn speed and the lack of a dynamic edge system, which halts camera rotation as you move the cursor inwards, makes it much easier to keep the target in view compared to what happens in SOCOM 4. Its smaller dead zone width being so wide compared to that of InFamous 2, you are forced to aim farther away from the center of the screen to keep the target in view. Actually, InFamous 2 feels very close to the way SOCOM 4 did when I tested it with the Franken-Move setup, a move sharpshooter hybrid which basically recreated the characteristics InFamous 2 provides by design. One last thing to mention about the camera behavior in terms of horizontal rotation refers to the dead zone width. Again, here is the wall dead zone represented in blue. Notice how the camera begins turning horizontally as the cursor moves away from the dead zone. Now, normally you would expect this behavior to be consistent across the whole screen height, as this is how the dead zone width should look like. But as you can see, the farther I move the cursor away from the middle of the screen, the farther I have to push it away from the center of the screen to trigger camera rotation. This happens both above and below the middle of the screen. So, while the dead zone width is indeed very small, this is true only as long as the cursor is vertically aligned to the center of the screen. Basically, as far as the dead zone width goes, its area is not shaped like a column, but rather like an hourglass, which I have roughly represented here. Odd, isn't it? Interestingly, this shape only applies to when orientating the camera in normal view. In fact, if I switch to aim mode, I get a dead zone which is consistent across the whole screen. Notice how the camera reacts as expected, whatever the distance of the cursor from the center of the screen. It goes without saying that, as you can see in this other sequence, if the on-screen cursor is located in the extra dead zone area in normal view, whenever you go into aim mode you get an intentional camera movement. Luckily, this is not a big issue, because you will generally aim at stuff located closer to the center of the screen anyway. But why the hourglass thing to begin with? Well, since I couldn't get in touch with the developers, I can't provide an official explanation, but I assume it is meant to sort of stabilize the camera when you want to look up or down. That is, avoid an intentional camera rotation when pitching straight upwards or downwards in spite of the small dead zone width. The reason why this is not applied to aim mode as well might be that in that case providing a tighter control over the camera is preferable due to the narrower field of view. In any case, regardless of the actual motivations, looking around in InFamous 2 feels very good whatever the view mode.
He's ours!
Alright, now let's compare the move with the DualShock 3 controls with regards to camera yawing, that is, camera rotation around its vertical axis. Let's set the DualShock 3 camera pan speed to fastest and see how fast it rotates when the right stick is tilted all the way to the right. Now let's compare it with the top speed we get with the move when bringing the cursor near the edge of the screen under the expert camera setting. As you can tell, the top speed is pretty much equivalent, the DualShock 3 one being just a tiny bit faster. Now let's compare top speeds in aim mode. In this case, the move turning speed appears to be faster by a more significant margin, but that's probably to compensate for the slower acceleration determined by the time it takes to bring the cursor near the edge of the screen. So while you might say the differences are pretty negligible overall, further investigation reveals that you can actually turn much faster with the move, that is, by pointing it outside of the screen. Notice here how the camera speed increases gradually the more I tilt the move to the right. That's because the acceleration area, here represented by an arrow, doesn't actually end at the edge of the screen, but farther away from it. So while you can match the DualShock 3 top speed by simply pointing at the edge of the screen, the higher resolution of move orientation sensing is put to good use here, providing extra speed, much like in Killzone 3. I don't think you need numbers to see the difference here. Here is another comparison showing the superior turning speed provided by the move controls. Notice the camera speed as I turn towards those cannons with the DualShock 3 on the fastest camera pan speed setting. And here is the same exercise performed by pointing the move outside of the screen on Expert. Of course, the lack of a dynamic edge system means halting the camera rotation is more problematic compared to Killzone 3. But while not a big deal, this is something that could have been mitigated with some tweaking of the camera deceleration. As you can see here, when inverting camera turn direction with the DualShock 3, a short deceleration occurs, followed by a fast acceleration, resulting in a smooth transition. Now, the same system is in place when using the move, but it doesn't take into account the fact that such camera transitions are already smoothed out by the very nature of the pointer-based controls. As a result, it takes more time for the camera to either stop or change direction, because it's basically undergoing two overlapping smoothing processes. Luckily, this extra delay is mostly noticeable when turning the camera at speeds above those the game was designed around, that is, above the top DualShock 3 turning speed, so it's not really an issue in the context of InFamous 2. But if I had to build a frenetic third-person multiplayer shooter around this move implementation, I'd definitely look into that. Another aspect worth discussing a bit refers to the camera assist. I understand most of you are against any sort of assist when it comes to move shooters, but I do believe some is needed regardless, especially in games with such a small dead zone. The camera is almost constantly moving, and the targets along with it. As you can hopefully see here, when using the DualShock 3, a little assist slows down camera rotation whenever the cursor hovers a target. Now, this assist is disabled when using the move, but look at the following sequence and focus on the position of the cursor relative to the target. Notice how, as I try to keep the cursor on the enemy while he runs to the right, I eventually overshoot, so to speak. Well, actually I didn't, or rather it was not my fault. Let's mark the location of the cursor relative to the screen here. This is where I'm pointing the move right now. Now look at what happens next. Notice how it's the camera panning that causes the cursor to move farther to the right of the enemy. The cursor itself does actually move inwards rather than outwards, as I compensate the camera drift to reacquire the target. A perhaps lighter version of the camera assist seen in Resistance 3, if not the very same one InFamous 2 provides when using the DualShock 3, could have helped in this case. Much like the smoothing one I have discussed previously, this is an issue that doesn't really compromise the game, but that's mostly because InFamous 2 is not that demanding in terms of accuracy to begin with. Generally speaking though, I do believe a well-implemented assist does no harm. Okay, now if you are still awake, I'd like to bring to your attention what I believe is the most significant quality of InFamous 2 move implementation. As you have likely noticed already throughout this analysis, there is something rather unusual about how camera pitching works. Normally, as long as the cursor is either above or below the dead zone, the camera would tilt upwards or downwards until it eventually reaches either ends of its rotation radius. In InFamous 2 instead, the camera pitch angle is dictated by the position of the cursor along the vertical axis. To better explain this behavior, I have built a visual representation of its underlying logic in Little Big Planet 2. The white hexagon is the cursor, the red bar represents the camera vertical rotation radius, while the black eye represents the current camera pitch angle. Notice how the black eye gravitates towards the cursor as I drag it along the red bar. This is exactly what happens in InFamous 2, the camera pitching towards the cursor as I move it along the vertical axis. This system allows for a greater camera stability whenever you are aiming above or below the dead zone. Notice here, for example, how the camera doesn't rotate upwards any farther, even though the cursor is above the dead zone, allowing me to easily acquire the target. You basically never have to babysit the camera when looking up or down. You simply point in the direction you want to look or shoot at, and the system accommodates that automatically. While this system is nothing new, it's called look spring, and it's actually pretty common in Wii shooters, and it's also included in the PS3 version of GoldenEye 007, it makes a huge difference, and it's a main reason why camera control feels so good in InFamous 2. Besides the superior stability it provides, the look spring system also adds to the tightness of camera pitching control. In SOCOM 4, for example, a dynamic edge system is in place for halting camera rotation without necessarily bringing the cursor back into the dead zone. See here how the camera stops pitching upwards as the cursor moves downwards towards the dead zone, even though it hasn't reached it yet. Now, while this system allows for rather quick camera stops, it doesn't do much with regards to camera direction changes. As you can see in this example, once the camera has stopped pitching upwards, you still have to bring the cursor all the way down to the bottom of the dead zone and beyond. With the look spring system instead, you don't need to do that, since the camera is constantly following the cursor. Notice here how whenever I change cursor direction, it eventually meets the black eye along the way, triggering a reversal in camera direction even before it has reached the dead zone. It basically feels like the vertical dead zone is constantly following the cursor, expanding and contracting according to its distance from it, regardless of the location of the actual dead zone. The red lines here represent the moment the camera pitching inverts its course. Notice how that happens before the cursor reaches the dead zone. Now here is another interesting aspect of this camera system. Notice how the more I wait for the camera to settle at a given angle, the sooner it reacts to cursor movements, to the point that it eventually feels like you have direct one-to-one control over it. This happens because once the black eye has reached the cursor, it sort of sticks to it like a magnet, until the cursor moves away fast enough to escape the attraction. Of course, the timings are different cause I didn't bother replicating the camera pitching speed accurately, but hopefully you can get the idea what's going on under the hood. Here is the same behavior exposed in the actual game. One last thing to note about this subtle behavior is that it doesn't manifest itself when the cursor is located within the dead zone, or within one of those two areas highlighted at the top and the bottom of the screen. In those places, the camera doesn't react to cursor movement, which is understandable with regards to the main dead zone, as it provides stability when looking forward, but it's rather curious with regards to the top and bottom areas. To be honest, I'm not sure why is that, but it's not something that negatively affects camera management anyway. Maybe it helps in keeping the camera steady when looking straight up or down, especially in aim mode. Everything I have discussed thus far, in fact, feels even tighter in aim mode due to the higher zoom factor. So maybe those two bars are meant to inhibit unintentional camera movements when aiming straight below or above you. Honestly, I have no idea. Whatever the purpose of those two bars actually is, they surely don't address the one issue I have with the camera pitching system. As you can see here, the time it takes for the camera to settle at a given angle is quite significant because it starts decelerating way before it has reached the final destination. This is especially obvious when comparing the pitching speed of the Move camera with the DualShock 3 one. Notice how faster it is to point the camera straight above or below you with the DualShock 3. This is not an issue related to the Move camera speed in general, but rather to its deceleration. The pitching speed is indeed equal across Move and DualShock 3 controls. Notice how the camera pitch angle reaches 0 simultaneously here. Past that point though, the DualShock 3 camera keeps going at the same speed, while the Move camera slows down quite severely. This issue is further exacerbated at beginner camera setting, the strong deceleration further aggravating its already low speed. What this means in practical terms is that looking straight down or up can be quite problematic. Moreover, in an attempt to speed things up, you naturally tend to tilt the controller more than you should, which then again might result in the camera stopping altogether, as you inadvertently tilt the Move past the pitching threshold that triggers camera lock, as discussed in the first part of this analysis. While not a game breaker by any means, as you generally don't fight enemies located that much perpendicularly to you, this is surely the weakest point of an otherwise flawless Move implementation. As a matter of fact, no other Move-compatible third-person shooter released thus far allows to look around as confidently and smoothly as InFamous 2 does. In case you need further proof of the effectiveness of InFamous 2 Move implementation as a whole, here is a couple of long gameplay sequences that will hopefully bring the point home. please sit back and enjoy the next 5 minutes. And that's all, folks. Hope you enjoyed this analysis. See you later. Ciao!
Damn. This thing's... damn.